Hello, welcome to our first ever virtual Society of Professional Women event with the Mainline Chamber of Commerce. We appreciate and ask for your patience while we enter this exciting new venture. I'm Nicole Stevenson, Director of the Society of Professional Women program here at the Mainline Chamber of Commerce. During this time of uncertainty, we are fortunate to be able to continue with this program today, and it's our hope to continue building relationships and providing professional development opportunities to our community whenever we can. Here are a few housekeeping items for today. After this webinar ends, we plan to share a recording of this with our attendees. We also plan to share a survey to provide us with valuable feedback. And in keeping with providing connections to our business community, we'd like to offer all registrants the opportunity to be connected to an attendee on the webinar today. Our plan is to send the attendee list to all registrants with the video and the survey. And if you see an individual that you would like to be connected to for a 15-minute phone call, please follow the instructions in the follow-up email regarding that request. President and CEO of the Mainline Chamber of Commerce, Bernie Dagenais, will be interviewing Robin Gerber today, and he will welcome you to the program shortly. We will have time for questions at the end of the program today, so please submit them in the Q&A section below. You can continue to support SPW by interacting with us and others on social media today using our hashtags, hashtag MLCC and hashtag SPW Mainline. We are very thankful that Robin Gerber has joined us from the other side of the country in California today. Robin is a powerful speaker, best-selling author, and historian. She will be on the upcoming CNN documentary series, American First Ladies, speaking about Eleanor Roosevelt in the fall of this year. She is the author of the bestseller, Leadership the Eleanor Roosevelt Way, Timeless Strategies from the First Lady of Courage. Barbie and Ruth, which is about the founder of Mattel and creator of Barbie, Ruth Handler, and several other books. Prior to becoming an author, Robin practiced law in Washington, D.C. and worked on Capitol Hill. She has studied and written about leadership development since 1975, and you can learn more about Robin at her website, robingerber.com. Barnes & Noble and King of Prussia ordered Robin's book prior to today's program. You can order them online or visit the store directly. I'd like to take a few moments now to say a few words about our featured nonprofit, the Justice Bell Foundation. Justice Bell Foundation is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate, inspire, and mobilize current and future voters. With programs for schools, a film about the women's suffrage movement, and a replica Justice Bell that is touring Pennsylvania in 2020, the Justice Bell Foundation is committed to reclaiming women's history and highlighting women's contributions. You can donate to their cause, learn more about their tour, and more at justicebell.org. Now, I'd like to take a minute to thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to be here. This program would not be possible without your support. Your involvement keeps SPW strong. I'd like to provide a special thank you to local filmmaker Jake Hansen Films, filming Robin's End, and of course MRS Audio Visual for providing a higher quality program today on such short notice to maintain our professionalism. I'd also like to thank Pictures by Todd Photography for documenting this very first moment for us. I'd like to thank a few additional event sponsors that stepped up for today's program, and they are Lincoln Financial Group and Nolan Painting, as well as our newest silver sponsor, CSL Bearing. Thank you to B101.1 for putting a short video together to help share our gratitude with our sponsors. They continue to invest in SPW's mission and vision and practice them daily in their respective organizations. I hope you all enjoy the program today. Please turn your attention to the video.
Guys, I'm Jen Ryan, so I am Jen from Jen and Bill in the Morning here on Philly's B101.1, and B101 is so happy to be a sponsor of the Society for Professional Women, and we want to welcome you to today's event, which could not happen without our sponsors. So I'd like to take a minute right now to thank them. The champion sponsor, Wells Fargo. Communication sponsor, Comcast Business. Employee benefit sponsor, USI Affinity, My Benefit Advisor. Women's Health sponsor, Mainline Health. Diamond sponsors, B101.1, Women Helping Women sponsor, Fidelity Investments, and education sponsor, St. Joseph's University. And now, our platinum sponsors, Stradley, Ronan, Stevens, and Young.
Hi guys, it's Phil Taffro from the Jen and Bill Show on Philly's B101.1. Thank you so much for listening to us every morning. And right now, I'd like to thank the gold sponsors of today's program. 1847 Financial, Closets by Design, Enterprise Holdings and Fleet Management, First Trust Bank, Mainline Today, Montgomery County Community College, MRS Audio, TechWise Group, UGI AmeriGas, United Healthcare, Univest Corporation, Valley Forge Casino Resort, and Vertex.
Hi, I'm Andrea Duffy. Thanks so much for spending your workday with me at B101.1. I'm here today to thank the silver sponsors of today's program.
Aqua, Devereaux Advanced Behavioral Health, Ernst & Young, Experience Chiropractic, Giant, Live and Grin Foundation, Lord & Taylor, Morton's The Steakhouse, Pico, Pictures by Todd Photography, Seasons 52, Suburban Square, Valley Forge Tourism and Convention Board, and WSFS Bank.
Okay, it's unmuted.
We have some special assistance today with this first virtual live Society of Professional Women event from MRS Audio Visual here in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Jake Hansen Films in Ojai, California. Thank you for handling technology for this first ever virtual live SPW event. I can tell you the chambers of commerce across Pennsylvania and across the country are interested in what we're doing here today. So how are you, Robin? What are things like in Ojai?
Doing really well, Bernie. Thank you so much for having me virtually. Eleanor Roosevelt would be proud of the Society of Professional Women and the Mainline Chamber because she was all about communication and doing it in every possible way. And here we are all learning a new way for some of us. And it's wonderful. And so thank you. And thanks to all of the people who are watching and listening to us today. It's a tough time. And so I'm really, really very happy to be here and help you out with this.
Great. We're happy to have you. We here are just next door to Montgomery County, which is really the epicenter of the coronavirus in Pennsylvania. And so it's very much on our minds, and our hearts go out to the individuals who are affected and all the companies that are being impacted by this. But let's move on to Eleanor Roosevelt. And our talk today is called Leadership, the Eleanor Roosevelt Way, which is the name of your book. And I know we want to talk about some of the challenges she's faced, but as we face this difficult time, it's hard not to think about how unprecedented it feels this time in our lives and is. But take us back, please, and share your knowledge as a historian. What are some of the difficulties our nation faced during Eleanor Roosevelt's time? What was it like for Americans?
Yes, well, she was sort of, the people of her generation were a bit like Forrest Gump because they lived through very, very major upheavals in society. So Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884, Victorian times, born into the Roosevelt family, not Franklin's side, but the other side, the Teddy Roosevelt side. And so she lived through, of course, World War I, which was a terrible upheaval for the whole world and also for this country. We entered just a little over a year before the war ended in 1917. But there was a draft, there was conscription. People's sons and husbands and brothers were going overseas to fight. We lost 400 plus thousand soldiers in that war. And of course, that ended in 1918. And actually, interestingly, of course, we're hearing a lot about the flu pandemic of 1918. more than half of the soldiers we lost in World War I were lost through illness. And a lot of that was from the pandemic. So it's not like we haven't been here before. And in fact, Franklin Roosevelt went over to see the battlefields in World War I right after the war in 1918. And he came back on a ship that was completely infected with the virus, with the flu virus. He was actually almost died. He was taken by an ambulance directly to the Roosevelt House in Hyde Park. And a very dramatic event happened between him and Eleanor because of that. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Dangle out that story for you. So that was tremendously difficult time, of course. And then just 11 years later, 1929, the Great Crash, the Depression, complete economic collapse in this country. And that was when then Franklin Roosevelt was elected president and Eleanor became First Lady. And of course, he put policies in place that greatly helped the country, but within 9 years of his election, or 11 years of his election, 1941, December 7th, 1941, there we were in World War II and the first peacetime draft. So yes, there have been tremendous upheavals, and Eleanor lived through all of them and learned from all of them.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. I think that's interesting that we don't think of FDR as self-quarantining, but it sounds like he must have had to do that at some point in his life under threat to his life and effect to his family and his friends. Tell us about how some of these major historical events affected Eleanor Roosevelt and how she dealt with them, if you would.
Yes, well, so let's start with World War I. She had married Franklin in 1905, and they had 4 children. Well, actually, they had 6 children, 1 died. So at that point, she had 5 children. And she threw herself into the war effort, as lots of women did. She became very active. The kids were getting old enough that she could be out of the house and working with the Red Cross, as a lot of women did. But it got her in contact with a lot of activist women in New York at the time. And so, as I said, there was a dramatic story when Franklin came home with the influenza virus, and he was too ill to even get out of bed. She unpacked his trunks, his big steamer trunks. And when she opened one of those trunks, she found a packet of letters, and she recognized the handwriting. They were written by her social secretary, a woman named Lucy Mercer. And she realized that Lucy and her husband were having a love affair, and she really had no idea about this. So right at the point where Franklin is actually near death, she confronts him, she offers him a divorce. He swears never to see Lucy again, and the marriage continues. His mother also tells him that he'll be cut off financially, and even at that point, he had thoughts about being president. So for all this constellation of reasons, they did stay together. Divorce wasn't as common, of course, at that time. But this event really changed Eleanor. The idea that she had finally found love in her life after a very, very terrible childhood, which we could talk about. This just, as she said, just it was as if the world dropped out from under her feet. And so after the war, shortly after the war, when she and Franklin faced another enormous crisis, which was that he contracted polio in 1921, only a few years after. And of course, in one night, went to bed and woke up having no use of his legs, and he would never walk again. He was a very athletic man. We have to think about Franklin like John F. Kennedy. He loved to sail and ride and do all kinds of physical things. He never would walk again. And suddenly, he thought his political career would be ended. But Eleanor, who had gotten a taste of working during the war and who felt alienated from him because of what happened with Lucy, she was able to pick up that Roosevelt mantle. And Franklin's political advisor, a man named Lewis Howe, said to her, "He needs you, we need you to go around New York State and keep the Roosevelt name alive." And that got her involved with the League of Women Voters, with Democratic women in New York State. And she discovered that people were interested in what she had to say, that she could learn to speak. She wasn't a very good speaker. I know a lot of our listeners are thinking, I'm more afraid of speaking than of anything. And so is Eleanor. But she learned, and she came to enjoy it. And she did indeed keep the Roosevelt name alive until Franklin ran for governor later in the 20s.
So that's great how she overcame a personal weakness, something she wasn't naturally comfortable with, and becoming a more effective speaker, which was so important to her impact on the world, of course. So is it correct she was saying she was breaking the glass ceiling in her day? And how was she different from other first ladies at that time?
Well, this was the beginning. This was really the beginning of it for her, was this activism in the 20s. And she was in New York State. New York State in the 1920s in America was a hotbed of women's political activity. Women, of course, had gotten the right to vote in 1920. So there was this tremendous activity, particularly in New York. And this gave her great training. And she made great women friends. And this is another thing that's important particularly for women today as well, is that we're supported and find people who can support us, and that we support each other. And she found this in the 20s. And so then when Franklin ran for governor in 1928, he won that race because Eleanor organized women to vote for him. They actually called it the Rainbow Campaign, which now has a different meaning, but then it was about women voters. And that was really how he won. So yes, that was the catapult to send him to the White House in 1932. Of course, stepping in after the disaster of the Depression with the New Deal programs that we're now familiar with. And here was Eleanor, who actually had no interest in being First Lady. And after they won and she came to Washington, she was walking with a friend of hers, a journalist named Lorena Hickok. And she said, you know, Lorena, I never wanted to be a president's wife, and I don't want to be one now. Because she had this great life that she built in New York with her friends, politics. She'd started a school for girls called Todd Hunter, where they were teaching girls to be leaders. And what did first ladies do? The history of first ladies was to hold teas and redecorate and pick new china. And this was the last thing that Eleanor wanted. She wanted a life of social activism. And so, as I said at the beginning, she started out as First Lady, breaking all the rules, the first one being communication. So they get to the White House, and she decides to hold a press conference. This had never been done by a First Lady. And then she announces that only women journalists will be invited, because it was the Depression and women journalists were being laid off before the men. So she knew this would mean that they would be able to keep their jobs. And then she scheduled this first press conference 3 days before Franklin's first press conference as president, which I think is just hysterical. And his press secretary was quite upset about it. But she got out there 3 days before Franklin, first time ever, First Lady holds a press conference. All these women come in. There's not enough chairs for them. They're sitting on the floor. The men are watching from the doorway saying, oh, they're just a bunch of docile news hens. This won't last a week. But in fact, those press conferences became some of the most important in the country, because she took the women journalists with her out to Appalachia, where people were so poor and out of work and children were dying in their houses, and publicized those kinds of things. She went down to Puerto Rico, which then was very, very poor and struggling, as it is now for other reasons. And so she used this press corps to publicize those things she cared about, and it gave her a platform, a national platform. Even though as First Lady she didn't have any real authority, she got moral authority by speaking to the American people. And let me tell you one other way she communicated. She had a column in a monthly magazine, very famous, called McCall's magazine. Maybe it's still around, not sure. And her first column she titled, "I Want You to Write to Me." Now, she was already getting hundreds of thousands of letters. As you can imagine, during the Depression, people writing to her saying things like, "If you have an old dress you're not wearing, could you send it to me? Because I don't have a dress to wear to church on Sunday. I only have one dress." That's how close they felt to her. But she wrote in this column, first column, "I want you to write to me." She said, "We don't know everything here in Washington. We want to hear about your problems, but we also want to hear about your solutions." And she got, that first month, 300,000 letters. More letters than the Lincoln and Wilson administrations got in the entire first year of their presidencies. People just wrote and told her, yes, what their problems were, what solutions they were looking for. And I think this is a great message for our listeners here today, that communicating is speaking, but it's also listening and being the kind of leader that's open to hearing what people have to say and what people want to tell you and what their ideas are. That people feel comfortable doing that with you is critically important. And it built Eleanor's stature to a place where she had great authority within the country.
Well, those are some great anecdotes, and I can't help but think about the women reporters and the opportunity that they received. And you don't really know what people can do until you give them an opportunity. It certainly applies to so many management situations where you sometimes can be surprised on what someone can do. And you're not going to know that unless you give them a chance to do it, of course. And that applies to men and women, of course. There's a great quote Eleanor Roosevelt said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." It seems like it might be easier to say than to live by. But what does she mean? And how do you think that plays out in the lives of women today?
Well, I think that's really about criticism. And, perhaps this extreme moment is going to push us past what stops us in terms of criticism. Women do seem, and psychological studies show us that women are more sensitive to being criticized because, women are taught to take care. Men are taught to take charge, as we've seen in some other studies. So that inclination makes us more sensitive to criticism. And Eleanor suffered a lot of criticism for being outside the box, as I've been describing. So she had several things she said about criticism. One thing she said was, you have to get skin as thick as a rhinoceros hide, which I think is just a terrific image to keep in our heads. She also said, women are like tea bags. We don't know how strong we are until we get in hot water. And I think that's very applicable for today. We're all in hot water, and all of our strength is going to be tested. But the most significant quote is the one that you said. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. And by that, she was referring to the idea that, and I've heard a lot of women have said this to me, that you're sitting in a meeting and you put forward an idea and it seems to be ignored. But then a man in the room, frankly, puts out a similar idea and they're listened to. And so you can take that as there's something wrong with you, but Eleanor says, no, only if you consent do you have to feel inferior, and don't consent to that. Instead, have faith in yourself, have faith in your ideas. And that was how she operated. But let me say, I think a more significant quote of hers for right now, and I've been thinking about this a lot, obviously, is we don't become heroes overnight, just a step at a time. Finding strength, courage, and confidence every time we look fear in the face. And that is what's happening now. We're all fearful. It's only natural to be fearful, men and women alike, and our children. And we have to understand that courage isn't something you snap your fingers and get. It takes a step at a time. And this quote, we don't become heroes overnight, just a step at a time, finding strength, courage, and confidence every time we look fear in the face. That quote of Eleanor's comes from a person who suffered from deep fears her whole life. Her mother was very unloving to her, so she felt very abandoned by her. Her father was an alcoholic and drug abuser who was basically kicked out of the family when she was 5. Her mother died of disease when she was 8. Her little brother the next year. Imagine the fears of a child, that you lose your mother and your little brother when you're 8 and 9. And then when she's 10, she loses her father, her beloved father, who, despite his alcoholism, despite his promising things he didn't deliver, she adored him. So here she is, a 10-year-old orphan with another little brother, and they go to live with her grandmother. Now her grandmother is dealing with 4 adult children who are completely out of control, Eleanor's aunts and uncles. And one of the uncles is, well, he's an alcoholic and probably had some mental illness. But we know that when she's 14, 3 locks show up on her bedroom door. And she tells her friend who comes to visit that they're there to keep her uncle out. Now, we know today that she would have been a prime candidate for abuse. She described herself in her diary from those years as lonely, depressed, afraid of everything, afraid of other people, afraid of being alone, afraid of mice, of the dark. So how did she come to be the Eleanor that we know today? It's because when she was 14, her grandmother decided to send her overseas to a school called Allenswood in London. And the headmistress of that school, a woman named Marie Silvestre, was the stranger who came into Eleanor's life and saved her. She took her under her wing. She gave her confidence. She taught her that she could be independent. She loved her and cared for her in a way that Eleanor had never experienced. And after 3 years at Allenswood, when she came back as a debutante and went to the ball where she saw her 5th cousin twice removed, Franklin, he fell in love with her. Not because she was the prettiest. She was not the prettiest. But she was committed. She was interested. She was thinking about social issues and causes. She was secretly going to the Bowery to work with a new organization called the Junior League to help poor children. And that's what Franklin cared about. And that's how that great partnership, a partnership that in a lot of ways saved our country, that's how it came to be. So I'm telling this story because we all have difficulties in our past. I hope no one as dire as Eleanor's, but we all have that. She drew on that, on those difficult times. She drew on the tragedy in her life, in her young life. And later she said, character building begins in infancy and continues until death. And so she interpreted these hard times as character building. And that's, I think, part of our mission for ourselves right now, is finding the character building as we build our courage one step at a time. Okay, Bernie, you can talk now.
That's incredible, Robin. There's so much in there. Sadness, it's compelling. When you think about the fact that she was really stepping out of her comfort zone so often, the quotes that she had, the thoughts that she shared, and the impact that they had were so powerful. And then we heard a story of mentorship certainly in there that is very powerful as well. So there's a lot in what you just shared, and I think it is very, very powerful. So I can see why you were fascinated by Eleanor Roosevelt so much that you spent so many hours studying her and writing about her and sharing her story with the world. I congratulate you for that. Are there any of this?
Let me just
go
say,
ahead, please.
I do say, what I ask myself is, what would Eleanor do? I've been asking myself that a lot lately. I lived in D.C., Washington, D.C. during the sniper crisis. And everything was canceled, including my women's soccer games. I used to play women's soccer. And it became very frustrating, and there was a lot of fear. There was a tremendous amount of fear. And I would quote Eleanor all over the place with this wonderful quote of hers. Courage, she said, courage is more exhilarating than fear. And in the long run, it's easier. It's easier.
Wow. We actually were talking before we came on camera about the fact that we both lived in Washington, D.C. I was there in that period of time as well. I can remember ducking as you were pumping gas, because that's where a lot of the shootings occurred, is people who were pumping gas. What an amazing thing. We did get past that, and we will get past this as well. I'm curious if there are other stories, Eleanor, that you would like to share before we move on to some other topics here today that you haven't been involved with and have written about. What else would you like?
I did promise to tell the Lucy story, so I don't want to.
Please do.
I don't want to be like one of those TV shows where they don't tie up all the plot lines, you know.
Well done.
So later, let's fast forward to the end, toward the end of World War II, April 12, 1945. Of course, the World War II had been going on for 4 years. It took a tremendous toll on Franklin Roosevelt. Because of his polio, he had built a house in Warm Springs, Georgia, where there were natural hot springs. And these really eased the pain in his legs. And this became a famous resort or place for people with polio. And on this day, April 12, 1945, he was sitting in the great room of this house, signing papers. His secretary was there. And a painter was there, a woman named Elizabeth Shumatoff, painting his portrait. She had been brought there by Lucy Mercer. Yes, the same Lucy Mercer who he promised never to see again back in 1918 when Eleanor found the letters. In fact, we know today, we actually found out only a few years ago from letters that were released, that he had never stopped seeing Lucy. She came to the White House under assumed names, and they had continued their affair. On this day, though, April 12, 1945, as he was signing letters, he suddenly slumped over and said, "I have a terrible pain in my head." And within hours, he had died. Now, Eleanor was back in Washington, D.C., and they rushed her back to the White House, told her what happened. The first thing she did, and think about fear, the first thing she did was cable her 4 sons. They were all fighting at that time overseas in World War II. She said, "Carry on as your father would want you to." And then she was rushed down to Warm Springs. And when she got there, there were only 2 people left. Lucy had taken off with the painter. Her 2 cousins were there, Daisy Suckley and Laura Delano. And she asked them to sit down on the couch and tell her about Franklin's last moments. Daisy said, "Well, he seemed tired, and then suddenly he was gone." But Laura Delano did not really like cousin Eleanor very much. And she said, "Well, Eleanor, actually, Lucy Mercer was here. She brought her painter friend, and she was sitting right there on the window seat when Franklin died. And she's been seeing him in the White House, even though you don't know it." Eleanor was absolutely shocked. She went into the room where Franklin lay, came out just described as stone-faced. A special train carried his body back up to Washington. The railroad tracks were lined with tens of thousands of people came to watch that train go by, and she was on it. And we can only imagine what she thought. After the funeral, she got out of Washington as quickly as she could. President Truman, vice president, became president, offered to let her stay in the White House as long as she wanted. They'd been there 13 years. But she said no, she wanted to go up to Hyde Park, upstate New York. There she had her own house called Valkill. But the great house where Franklin had been born, Springbrook, was being given to the American people. And I'm sure some of our listeners have been there. And so Eleanor had to pack up the house. And as she did, Daisy came to help her. And as they were packing, she found a small portrait of Franklin, painted by Elizabeth Shumatoff, that same painter, Lucy's friend. And she handed that portrait to Daisy and said, "Please send this to Lucy Mercer. Now, I know some of our listeners, if we were in a room together, I know I would be seeing some shaking of heads and people saying, oh no. I'm not sure I could have had the grace to do what Eleanor did. But she had learned a step at a time. She had learned that if she was going to move forward in her life, if she was going to continue to live a life of purpose, to face the challenges and fears that lay ahead, and there were more in her life, she had to send that portrait back. I think it's a great metaphor for us now that we need to clear ourselves of any anger and sorrow and frustration and resentments, which she surely had. She was not inhuman. Surely she felt those things. But by the time she found that portrait, she was able to send it back, take a moment of grace. Lucy took it that way. She sent her a lovely letter, which we still have, thanking her for it. And so she closed that circle and let go of her resentment and face the challenges ahead. And I would say right now, if you're holding on to any portraits, please, let's all send our portraits back. We can't afford them. We need all of our strength and courage to face this moment.
Okay, I got to say, wow, at all that. That's quite a story. I appreciate you sharing it. So I want to move on now. Interestingly enough, from Eleanor Roosevelt to Barbie. This is not my fault. You made this happen because you've written about Barbie as well twice. So why is Barbie important?
Yes, I did write about Barbie, actually. I did write, my latest book was for Mattel. They asked me to write Barbie's 60th anniversary book. And
so the marketers must have just put her on the cover then, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the marketers, the first book is a biography of the woman who founded Mattel Toys and created the Barbie doll. It's a biography, the first biography, the only biography of Ruth Handler, who was one of the greatest CEOs of the 20th century and has quite a dramatic story. Now, she is a woman who was first generation. Her parents were immigrants to this country. They didn't speak a word of English. They never spoke English. She was never really able to communicate with them very well. They were Jews who emigrated from Poland, and she actually ended up being raised because she was the 10th and last child of her mother. She was raised by her oldest sister because her mother was too ill to raise her. But Ruth married a young man from Denver, from her neighborhood, named Elliot Handler. They moved down to Los Angeles. She was an unstoppable entrepreneur. He was a shy, quiet designer. And he started designing toys, and that's how they first built Mattel Toys. And then in 1959, at a point when Mattel was already worth $100 million, which was a lot of money at that time, in 1959, she was the one who came up with one high concept. Little girls want to play at being big girls. One high concept. And there were no adult dolls, adult women dolls for girls to play with. She'd seen her own daughter playing with paper dolls that were adults, and she realized she needed an adult doll. And that's how Barbie came to be. And yes, she has unrealistic proportions. That's because in the toy industry, as in other industries, one thing that people did was copy from each other. She happened to be on a trip to Europe. She found a doll called Build Lily, which was a sex toy for men. And she bought several of them, came back and said to her designers, here's what I've been talking about. Her male designers did not think they could sell an adult women's doll. They said no mother will buy her daughter a doll with breasts. But she came back and said, here it is, make this, and the rest is history.
Incredible. Another fascinating person you've written about. I'm interested in how the choices that you've made. Katharine Graham, an impressive, legendary, really Washington Post publisher who dealt with the suicide of her husband. She made controversial decisions that really changed the course of history during the time of the Pentagon Papers and later Watergate. What were some of your takeaways after studying Katharine Graham?
Yes, and the choices have a similarity you might have noticed, which is I write about women. Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, said that women are the most spectacular casualty of history. So I've tried in my little tiny way to change that. And so, yes, I mean, the idea that there was no book about Ruth Handler seemed unbelievable to me, because her corporate skills were incredible. Talk about someone who broke the glass ceiling, starting a company in an industry where there were no women, the toy industry, in 1945. Later, actually being convicted kind of in a Martha Stewart moment of fraud in her company in the 70s, being pushed out of Mattel and starting a new company making prosthetics for women who had lost their breasts from mastectomies, which she had herself. So, you know, and I'll talk about Catherine in a second, but what interests me about these stories is those moments of transformation where there is such difficulty in somebody's life, a moment like we're all facing now, and how they deal with that. How Ruth came back from losing the company and wanting to commit suicide after that, but she came back with this wonderful new company that changed her life personally because she was helping women, and that gave her a happiness she never knew before. Catherine, similarly, Catherine Graham, she was born into a wealthy family. Her father was head of the Federal Reserve at one point. He bought a struggling newspaper called the Washington Post in the 30s. She married she wanted to be a journalist, but you know, women stayed home at that time. She married a very high-flying lawyer out of Harvard. And her father gave Phil Graham the newspaper, and he was running the newspaper. And this was in the 1940s. But he had bipolar disorder, which was not diagnosed at the time. And Catherine was home with their 4 children, and he was abusing her. She was abused psychologically, and she was abused physically. And in 1963, in August, his disease had gotten so bad that he had been institutionalized, and he begged to come to their country house for a weekend. She brought him there, and while she was sleeping upstairs, he went into a bathroom, took a shotgun, and killed himself. So that transformational moment for her, and a woman who suffered domestic abuse, who lost this man who she deeply loved, and yet 3 days later, she walked into the boardroom of the Washington Post and said, I'm not going to sell the paper, which they thought she would. I'm not going to let anyone else run it, which they expected. I'm going to be the publisher. How did she find that courage at that moment to do that? And then go on, as you said, to win the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, which was a secret history of Vietnam, if people don't know, that was published in 1971. And then 3 years later, exposing the malfeasance of President Nixon in the Watergate scandal, which led to him resigning from office. So all of these people are iconic in what they achieved. But I think what's important for us to remember is that a step at a time, they found their strength, courage, and confidence. And by the way, the end of that quote is this: you must do the thing you think you cannot do. And that's where we all are right now.
That's certainly a theme that's come up at other Society of Professional Women programs, taking the chance, doing something that scares you, stepping out of your comfort zone, and kind of the difference that can make when you get out there on the edge. So studying these women, and many talks, you're an accomplished public speaker, obviously, and specifically addressing the power of women, particularly as leaders. How have we evolved as a society, you think? Where do we fall short?
Well, we certainly fall short in just factual parity, P-A-R-I-T-Y. That is, you know, the sheer numbers of women who have gotten positions of authority in every sector, from the corporate world to the military, to government, to religion. I mean, I've spoken in front of nuns and at West Point and all throughout the federal and state government events, at schools, academia. So, honestly, I'm 68, and I thought that my 38-year-old daughter would be living in a truly equal world for women, and she's not. So have we made progress? Yes, we have made progress, but not nearly enough. And of course, we see that at the highest level in terms of having our top leader of the country still, we're still electing men. But we have the opportunity, perhaps, of having a woman vice president, maybe from either party this year, depending on what the politicians do.
So let's talk about the presidential politics for a minute. As we're recording this today and having this live event as well, Gabby Gifford has announced that she's dropping out of the race. So after having considerable number of strong women running for president this year, we're down to 2 older white men again.
Yeah.
A lot of people are upset about that. What's your take on it?
Yeah, Tulsi Gabbard, you mean, by the way.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's easy to get them confused.
Yeah.
Well, I believe in democracy, and people have voted, and this is what people have decided. I think it does show that there's I do believe that a lot of it is underlying sexism. And when I say that, I don't mean that people are walking around saying, I don't think women are good enough. I think this is very deeply enculturated, so we're not even aware of it. Many people have said to me, well, my mother could have been president. The people we know, the women we know, we believe can achieve. It's the women we don't know, and this cultural bias that still says that we don't equate women with leadership. Certainly, any one of the women who ran would be a terrific president of the United States. And on the Republican side, we have had many women who certainly could have run this country very well. There's rumors that President Trump might replace Mike Pence with Nikki Haley because of, this kind of idea that women are very powerful voting, and maybe this would help bring in the women's vote. But as you say, look at the women's vote. We had a very high women's vote in the Democratic primaries, and yet they didn't vote for a woman.
So who's your pick for the Democrats' vice presidential nominee?
Well, I'm sure we have Republicans and Democrats listening. So it's true, I am a Democrat. And honestly, I think it's a tough one. I liked Amy Klobuchar a lot. But I live in California and I love Kamala Harris. So, and I think Elizabeth Warren is just fantastic. It's really tough. I'm just very pleased that Joe Biden, Vice President Biden, has said he will pick a woman as vice president. That will be truly historic. Eleanor is clapping from somewhere and is quite happy about that. Eleanor Roosevelt, let me just put this in. Eleanor Roosevelt very much was promoted to run for president in 1940 because it was a third term for Franklin, and people were not very happy about that. There was, if it weren't for the war, I don't think he would have been able to run. And so she was promoted, and there was, I actually wrote a novel about this called Eleanor versus Ike. It's an alternative history that thinks about, that is the story of what might have happened if she had been the Democratic candidate in 1952. She did not feel in 1940 when she was pushed to run that the country was ready for a woman president. And I often laugh about that because wouldn't she be surprised in 2020 that the country still doesn't seem ready for a woman president?
Right. So what are some of the key pieces of advice you give to individuals seeking to expand their influence and attain leadership roles?
Well, what you said is usually important for women, taking risks. We have lots of psychological studies that show that women are less risk-taking than men. Men have something called positive illusion, and there's a great cartoon about this. A man is looking in the mirror, and the reflection he's seeing is sort of a Charles Atlas, well-built, good-looking, but the actual man who's looking in the mirror is overweight and sloppy and, looks terrible. So men see themselves with this positive illusion. Women, in the cartoon, there's a beautiful woman looking in the mirror and she's seeing someone who's overweight and, isn't as attractive. So how does this play out? Well, you can go up to a good-looking, silver-haired corporate executive, well, kind of like you, Bernie, and say, I think you could run for the United States Senate. And men will say, well, yeah, I have thought about that. That's a good idea, with no experience whatsoever. But you can talk to a 5-term woman member of Congress and say, time to run for Senate. And she'll say, well, I don't think I have enough donors yet. I need to serve on higher level committees. And this plays out in the corporate world, and I'm sure you've seen it, where women feel that they need to get that next degree, or they need to get a more important client before they go for the higher job, or they're offered a stretch assignment and they don't want to take it because they're not sure they're experienced enough. And what I say is, think about what your male colleagues do. They say yes like that. And I'm sure you've seen this, Bernie. And on the side of the men, because the men are still mostly in charge, you have to be thinking about whether you are truly being fair in how you're treating the women employees. And I'm sure you believe you are. But for instance, I was at a major company in the South, I won't say where, and very top level women in the room. The CEO was sitting there and one of them got up, I think it was the general counsel, woman general counsel got up and said, why is it that you have never taken any of us to lunch? And he was actually shocked because he didn't realize that unconsciously he was taking the male hierarchy in the company to lunch, maybe to golf, and he hadn't taken any of the women, and he changed that. So these are unconscious things. They're not being done intentionally. Giving that stretch assignment to a woman, to thinking about, have I really done that in a fair way, is hugely important. So that's the other side of it. And then on our side of it, we have to be ready to say yes as women.
Fair point. I won't be running for Senate, however. I don't think it's a good idea. But the point is well taken and correct, I'm sure. So I want to throw out words or a phrase and ask you to respond to these words and kind of what do you think of. So let's start with naysayers. Well,
we just can't surround ourselves with them. In fact, the fewer of them you have in your life, the better. I'm the kind of person who finds it very hard to deal with people like that because I'm extremely optimistic. So yeah, when I decided to change my life to be an author, I was a lawyer, I was a lobbyist on Capitol Hill. I had some friends who said, what are you talking about? You can't sit in a room and write, you're a people person. And I just sort of stopped talking to them about becoming a writer because that naysaying was hurting my confidence. So look for the yay-sayers.
Right. People who feed your dreams. So that might be, maybe that brings us to the next point. Champions is the word I want to throw out.
Well, we're all champions if we want to be. I think that's whether it's being a champion to your child and what you're giving them and how you're raising them, or more importantly, a champion to yourself and really believing in the things you've done and giving yourself credit. I mean, I'll admit, one day a friend came up to me and she said, you never give yourself credit. You've written books. That's an incredible thing. And I see people congratulate you and you kind of brush it off. And it was true that I wasn't self-reflecting and saying, yeah, this was a big deal. This was a hard thing to do and I pushed through and I did it. So be a champion to yourself first, I would say.
How about sponsorship?
Sponsorship, not sure.
I think I mean when someone looks out for you, chooses you as someone who's rising in an organization, might support you and help you to get there.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I would say don't wait for it to happen.
Right.
Be proactive about that. Think about who can help you. There's not, women don't like the idea of transactional, things being transactional, but it's okay. It goes back to taking care and not taking charge. We just want to help everybody else, but oh my gosh, we don't want to do something for ourselves. So, it's okay. It's fine to be transactional. It's fine to look for that sponsorship. It's fine to, if you feel like someone has praised you or seems interested in you, it's fine to follow up on that. And that goes back to the risk taking. And how do you do risk taking? Well, if you're finding it hard, talk to a friend. Don't, Eleanor liked to do things in a gang, as her famous biographer said. She always had friends around, friends she could rely on. If you have to, do a little role playing before you talk to Bernie because he seems like he's too important to talk to or whatever it is. And then do it. Do it. There's no substitute for action.
So such a common theme that comes up in our leadership programs or our women-to-women mentoring programs is the theme of balancing work and personal life. And I'm sure it comes up in some of your talks and questions afterwards. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Well, there's no actual balancing of work and personal life, I think. It's not yet. Women are still 85%, of households have women who are doing most of the work within the household and then working outside the home. So I see it changing. I see it changing in my daughter's generation. Like I said, she's 38 with 2 little kids. Her husband does much more than fathers and husbands did in my generation. So it has to change at home, but it also has to change it in companies. So companies have to offer more support for men and women in the company for there to be real balance. So if you're feeling stressed about work-life balance, you're not alone.
Great. So I have a question from our audience here. What are the tools people can use to overcome their fears as Eleanor did?
Yes. I think that must be on everyone's mind. How did Eleanor overcome her fears? Well, I talked about, sending your portraits back, because those resentments and, the things you're holding on to feed fear on a different level. So that's one way. I think gratitude. She was actually deeply religious. She was Episcopalian. She always carried a poem or a prayer in her purse. She believed deeply that she would see her father, after she died. And so I think our spiritual lives are very important. And within those spiritual lives, the people who we love and encourage us in love and gratitude. And this was a big part of her life. And those are touchstones for us to hold on to right now. And if you're feeling fearful, don't be alone. Talk about it. Talk about it with your partner, your parent, your best friend. Work it through with someone. Let's not be alone in this. None of us are alone. We are all feeling this, and we can move through it, but it is going to be together. There's nothing more important right now than what happened in World War II and the Depression and World War I was bringing the country together. And, this was a great, great talent of our leadership, of the Roosevelt's leadership, was the fireside chats that Franklin would have, talking to America about staying strong and being together. And hopefully we'll see more of that kind of leadership in this country. We need it.
And I think we all can play a role, certainly, in bringing people together, the people in our networks and our companies. Another question from the audience is, what's the importance of mentorship, and how do you recommend people find one?
Yes, well, as I was saying, I think you have to think about, and this, of course, men and women as mentors, whoever as a mentor, you have to think about within the company you're in, who is someone that I've observed, that I've vetted, who I think would be someone I could connect with well and who could help me. And it's okay, again, let me say again, being transactional is okay. You're going to help that person as much as they help you. Hold on to that idea. There's no one I have mentored in my life or who I've been a mentee for where I have not felt that we've had a very mutual relationship, because the person who agrees to do it wants to do it, and we all get something from our service. So let me just say, in terms of how to do it, find that person, and then you say, oh yes, but I'm terrified to go talk to them. I get it. When I wanted to be a writer, there was a man at the Washington Post newspaper who I wanted to help me. I must have picked up that phone 5 times and dialed his number and never let it connect because I was so afraid. But then I finally did. Again, meet that person at the water cooler or in the snack room if you see them, and just say those words. Would it be possible for me to sit down with you for 15 minutes? And if it feels too hard, find a friend and practice it. Don't give up. You can do this. And again, there is no substitute for action. Find the person, take the step, make the ask, and I promise you, if they agree to sit down, it's because they like you and they want to help you.
I'm going to put two questions together from our audience. Someone wants to know about where you find the inspiration to write about these women, how you decide who you're going to write about. And then also, what's your motivator? What's your greatest motivator?
Well, my greatest motivator is my own call to social action, I guess. At 68, I've actually been thinking about this quite a bit. I've always been involved in the women's movement since I was in my 20s. I've always thought it was profoundly unfair, the inequity that I saw, in my own life, the kinds of opportunities that I didn't get because I was a woman, and it was quite obvious. It made me angry, and I guess to some extent that anger fueled my motivation. And there's still some of that anger about our lack of equality. I found Eleanor because, I'll tell you how I wrote that book. It was my first book, and my mentor, who was a man, James McGregor Burns, a famous historian, I was writing opinion pieces for newspapers, and he said, you need to write a book. Books last. So there is a whole genre of books out there. You can find them. Lincoln on leadership, Patton on leadership, Reagan on leadership, Gandhi on leadership, the Founding Fathers on leadership, Cigars, Whiskey, and Winning, Ulysses S. Grant on leadership, Jesus Christ, CEO. Are you getting the point? When I looked at that genre, they were all men. And I thought, well, I could write a book like this, but I need to write about a woman. And when I looked, I found one book like this about a woman. Elizabeth I, CEO. And I thought, really? I have to reach across the ocean and back 500 years to get inspiration? I don't think so. And no one had done Eleanor Roosevelt, which shocked me. I didn't know her very well. I didn't know that much about her, probably no more than most people listening. But it turned out that we were a great partnership, and that book's been selling actually very well for 15 years, and I evolved a speaking career from it. The next book I wrote was Katharine Graham, which my publisher asked me to write, and was very fun to write. Ruth Handler I found in a book about women entrepreneurs that Radcliffe University had put out. And again, I couldn't believe it when I found her, that no one had written about the woman who founded Mattel and created Barbie. But we all know Walt Disney. So that's how I found Ruth Handler. And I'm looking for my next subject.
That's great. You might get some suggestions.
Always happy. And let me say, if you're thinking about being a writer out there, writers are people who write. So please write, and write to me. I'd be very happy to hear from you.
Very nice. You're echoing Eleanor Roosevelt there. That's great. And I know robingerber.com. They can find information about you on there and how to reach you. Any final thoughts for our audience today, Robin, as we're wrapping up here?
Courage is more exhilarating than fear. And in the long run, it's easier. I think that's the best thing to hold on to right now. Gratitude and loving your family, and a day at a time. There is no other way to go on through this other than just taking it a day at a time. It is the uncertainty right now that's so difficult. And let me just say that psychological studies show that women actually handle ambiguity better than men. Sorry, Bernie. But men like to get from A to B. And when it's A to B, or maybe C, or maybe Z, which is kind of where we are right now, women are more comfortable with that. And so we may, in fact, emerge as even better leaders during this time. So, and yes, please, let me say, please go to robingerber.com. I would love to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your insights today. And really inspiration comments, I think, about future moving forward and the present and things we can do to make a difference. I'm going to move into a brief wrap up, but thank you, Robin. I'll say goodbye to you right now and tell you I really appreciate your time and your thoughts and all the effort you put into learning these stories and sharing them with us today.
Thank you, Bernie. And let me say also that if anyone is at a company out there that would like a telecast like this, I'm happy to set it up with them as well during this time. So
that's great.
robingerber.com. Thanks very much. Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you, Robin. So I invite our online audience to stay with us just for a minute as I share some final thoughts ending our program today. I want to thank all of our SPW sponsors, Society of Professional Women sponsors, and Mainline Chamber of Commerce members and supporters. As we go through this difficult period of time, you can count on us to provide greater communications, share information about our members, connecting them with information about things that they need, things they can get, what government is doing, the support for nonprofits that are out there, how people can do business with each other. This is such an important role that the Mainline Chamber can play. So if you're on our email list, you should watch. Just for example, we're putting together a list right now of member restaurants that are offering curbside pickup, try and help them get some additional business. The Mainline Chamber has produced the Society of Professional Women since its first days, more than 10 years ago now. It's become our largest program. And we've proven that the Chamber and SPW are stronger together than either could be alone. And this really applies to all of us. We're stronger together. We'll consider how we can make this video event available to individuals. You heard Nicole at the beginning of this program talk about making a video link available once we have the recording ready to go. In addition, if companies or women's resource groups within companies in particular would like to share this video with employees, we will work with Robin to make sure she's compensated for her intellectual property, and we'll make that available so that you can share it. And also you can reach out to Robin individually. You can buy one of her books through her website, certainly, at robingerber.com, or reach out to Nicole. So many of you who are with us today have a great relationship with the Mainline Chamber of Commerce and the Society of Professional Women. Let Nicole what you need. Reach out to me with something that we can do to help. That is where we want to be. That's where we will be through this period of time. So people matter, right? The relationships matter, our families, our coworkers, people we love. Having good people in our lives is always important. And perhaps we're just being reminded of that in these difficult times. So one of the messages I get from the Society of Professional Women has to do with all of our interactions. And if we look for the worst in people, we may well find it, but if we look for and encourage the best, we will bring that out of our employees, colleagues, those we report to, and those we love. So when you see Nicole and I today, while you see us in front of these cameras and on this program, we're supported by an amazing team made up of Kristen DeLulo, Ksenia Hevka-Scott, Tatiana Sawchak, Stacy Reimel, Kelly Gray, Powell Davis, Ronnie Boyd, and Barb Keslick. Thanks to the Chamber team for all they do. Those who know me know I tend to have a song in my mind as I go through my day, and for some reason, I don't know where they come from. They're pretty obscure sometimes. But today's song, as I was thinking this morning, was There's Got to Be a Morning After from the Poseidon Adventure. And there will be a morning after. I wish you all, from my heart, an energizing, profitable, and safe remainder of 2020. Thank you for joining this live Society of Professional Women event.